Great, thank you for everyone for joining. Is everyone able to turn their mic and camera on? Great, over to you, Maria.
Hello, thank you, Lawrence. Is Michelle okay? Is she here yet? Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. This is the last day of this year's Rethinking Economics Festival. I'm Maria. I will be your host in this session called Learning to Unlearn to Relearn. And we also have with us Lawrence, who makes sure the software is working properly. So if you have any technical difficulties, please send him a message in the chat and he will do his best to help you out. We also have with us today Meixieira Groenewald. I hope I said that right. And we'll discuss challenging the economics curriculum that dominates most departments which teach economics in some degree. Michelle studied economics and political economy of development in South Africa and the UK, and that's when she became involved with rethinking economics herself. Although currently she's teaching in South Africa, and she's writing about the changes that we need to make in economic curricula and the discipline overall to make it representative of the people whose lives it describes and affects. So we invited her today to talk about what decolonial scholarship is. It connects into the economics curriculum, and what it would mean to use the scholarship to change the way we learn economics and the way we teach them. Before I hand the mic over, some practicalities. We'll have Michelle talk for a bit, and I think she also has some slides prepared. After that, we'd really love to get your questions, your thoughts, ideas on the things we're discussing, and you can put those in the Q&A. I will invite you to turn your mic on at the end of the session and read your comment. But know that you can also post them anonymously if you want to. And that was all from me. So, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Double check that everyone is able to see that. I'm seeing it on my side, so I'm trusting that everyone can.
Yeah, it's perfect. We can see.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be here. So I'm going to jump straight into it. And so I suppose I just want to emphasize that this presentation can be much, much shorter if you are all really keen to get involved and to contribute. But of course, I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. And if you don't feel like contributing, you don't have to. But as you're going to see with some of the things that I'm going to discuss from decolonial scholarship, it would be absolutely wonderful if I was not the one who was talking the whole time. Yeah. Okay. So on to that first point. Part of what we're going to take a look at within decolonial scholarship is a lot in relation to the idea of breaking down hierarchies, especially when it comes to knowledge hierarchies. And so I really want to emphasize that just because I spend a large amount of my time reading up on this and teaching this does not mean that I am the fountain of all knowledge. I see that there is a host of people that have joined, and amongst all of you, you definitely have more knowledge than what I do. So please feel free. Yes, you are more than welcome to ask questions in the question and answer session. But realistically, what I would love session. So if you are comfortable with this, to rather please share your experiences, your proposals, your knowledges, because I think that that is part of what we need to be doing in order to be able to transform our economics curriculums specifically, right? So what I would hope is that at the end of the session, you would all leave with many, many more questions, and I too would leave with many more questions. I don't think that the answers to this massively complex topic are simple or easy. And so if anything, I would hope that we would all leave feeling encouraged by all the questions that we have. And then hopefully that we would leave with ways for us to be able to question more or better, whatever those words may mean. Right, so I am starting with a picture that was taken by San Haffajee. This was taken in 2016. So I don't know exactly who makes up the audience here, but in South Africa in 2015 and 2016 particularly, we had protests in South African universities around, firstly, roads must fall and then fees must fall, where students in South Africa were calling for a free decolonized education. And so I don't have enough time to be able to go into all of this, but I do think that this picture for me that I often show to my students and try to share with others in presentations is such an astounding form of knowledge that is encapsulated in the single picture. When students were calling for a free decolonized education, they were met with a lot of resistance, and part of that was the militarization of universities, with students being arrested, being shot at with tear gas and water cannons. And so this is a student offering a flower to a member of the police here in South Africa during these protests. And when I'm sometimes frustrated and confused and uncertain about how we go about taking on the massive challenges that exist just in trying to break down the hegemony of mainstream economics. This picture's knowledges that exist within it, there are so many stories being told here, is often what drives me to ask myself how I can continue to fight the good fight, whatever that may entail. And so for each of you in your own specific country contexts, you know, you will all have rich histories around protest, around student protest, around the site of the university and outside of the university. And I would really encourage each one of you, I mean, please, by all means, feel free in the chat to tell me, when you see a picture like this, what does it evoke within you? What are your thoughts? What are your questions around this? And perhaps just reflect for a moment on, very often in economics, you know, what is considered real economics is what gets published in the top 5 economics journals, what is in very mainstream textbooks. I don't know how many economists would think to themselves that a picture of a student protest is so filled with knowledge specifically for economists. So yes, I would be really keen for all of you to let me know what this picture evokes within you. I see Lawrence is saying hope, so a step, right? Okay, so part of decolonial and post-colonial scholarship is, I think, very important for all of us to reflect on how our positionality and situatedness will influence how and what we can even know. So as I'm talking through my own situatedness or positionality, I would really encourage all of you that have joined the session, or anyone who's going to watch the recording, to, as part of this broader discussion about learning to unlearn in order to relearn, to ask yourself how your own positionality or situatedness, how you have even come to know what you know up until this point, which, you know, for most of you is probably going to have been quite mainstream economics. I'm assuming we have lots of students in the audience, but please feel free to type into the chat and to let me know if we maybe have more activists or academics, those working in think tanks, NGOs, research entities, please let me know. But so to really ask yourself, how does your positionality or situatedness affect what you can know and how you come to know? And so I wanted to make reference to an article that I'd really encourage all of you to read. It's by Dengler and Sibbecker. It's actually in Ecological Economics. And they have 2 whole paragraphs, which I found really quite refreshing, where they are explicitly reflecting on their own situatedness as middle class, white, identify as female academics that are situated in the global north. And the question that I found myself asking is, how often does this happen in mainstream economics? Would we ever, in any of the top 5 economics journals or in some of the mainstream textbooks that get used to teach our students, see the authors themselves reflecting on their own positionality and situatedness? I don't think I've ever seen that. Maybe that, I think, is part of what we should be pushing for. I see here, we're getting Yes. I haven't seen it, but I would be so keen if anyone would be able to point me to an example of that. So I do think that it is important for me to reflect on my own situatedness, because my positionality is invariably going to color and influence and shape my understanding of the world and of the decolonial process. So certainly to reflect on my own whiteness and my white privilege. Much as I was born in South Africa, raised in South Africa, and I've lived here my whole life, except for when I went to study at the University of London at SOAS, my whiteness and my white privilege is inexplicably going to shape and color the way in which I understand the decolonial process. And so I've put this as a bullet point here at the end, but I really wanted to emphasize this, that if any participant feels that I have overstepped or I have misrepresented in any way, I would welcome being addressed and called out on this. I said in the session later on, but if you feel strongly about this, please immediately comment on it. Because that is part of my own process of unlearning. So yes, I may identify as a female. I may be considered middle class by most standards, but because of the massive income inequalities in South Africa, even just as a university lecturer that doesn't get paid particularly well, I'm still in a massively privileged position of having a full-time job. And because of the nature of just how unequal South Africa's income inequality is, I do make up the top 2% of income earners in my country. And so then, yes, in terms of my own upbringing within economics here in South Africa, my undergraduate and even postgraduate studies was really, really very, very mainstream. And through things like rethinking economics and also being given the opportunity to attend a program which is really wonderful here in South Africa called APPORD, the African Program on Rethinking Development Economics. I learned about SOAS in the University of London. And having finished my second master's degree there, I did actively choose to come and pursue an academic career in the global South at a university called the Northwest University. Despite the fact that I am told that I'm limiting my career and my opportunities as an economist, which is all part of us reflecting, I think, on what decolonial scholarship calls us to do, to ask ourselves, Shumin Mbembe talks about what it means to actually be a university in Africa in comparison to an African university. And Untunji, African philosopher, speaks very strongly about us feeling like in the global South, we have to go to institutions in the global North in order to get some sort of accreditation and affirmation and be seen as serious academics. And if we want to pursue a serious career, especially in economics, we need to go off to the global North. So I would love to hear other opinions and thoughts on this, but that's a little bit about my own positionality and situatedness. So I had titled this talk actually a phrase that is used at the Intercultural University of the People and Nations of Ecuador, which is this learning to unlearn in order to relearn. But again, if we think about things like knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, which really comes to the fore when Kilsanova and Mignolo, who are two post-decolonial scholars, highlight this in one of their 2012 books. Again, for us to reflect on the fact that when things are codified and when they are put down in this written form, when they are put into a book, the ways in which knowledge dissemination happens, right? Which makes very often oralism subordinate to the written word, right? This is not to say that there is not massive value in us writing things down, in us sharing through the written form, but we're going to talk a little bit more about this in terms of knowledges and whether that necessarily needs to be put in a academic journal article, in the written form. Also, very strongly is an influence of mine is a South African academic, Sabelo Ndlovu-Kgatsheni, who is speaking in his 2018 article about epistemic freedom being central to this process of decolonizing. And really talking about epistemic freedom is about democratizing knowledge from its current rendition in the singular into its plural, known as knowledges. And so I purposefully leave my presentation in this format so that you can see how foreign a concept this is to Microsoft's PowerPoint, yes? that knowledges needs to be highlighted in red. How many of the names and phrases that we are drawing from here within decolonial scholarship are underlined in red, right? As if there is something other about them to, putting in the name John Smith not being underlined, right? I think part of us thinking about decolonial scholarship in all aspects of our lives, right? Then perhaps something for us to think through. So this is an academic from New Zealand. And so Appleton wrote this, in essence, blog piece, talking about whether it's titled "Do Not Decolonize If You Are Not Decolonizing." And so every time I'm ever invited to speak about this, or when I'm trying to apply this in my own classroom setting, I think that it is useful and necessary for us to be open about the struggles and the tensions that we have in our own journey of unlearning, that I am always uncertain about even using the word decolonizing. I do think that it has such a massive amount of power and such potential and opportunity. Not that this is something that's completely brand new, right? Part of decolonial scholarship is for us to draw from and reflect on and take cognizance and give space and really highlight scholarship that has been happening for centuries, in essence. But that there is this tension between this word having so much power and at the same time, it's so easily being co-opted to become nothing but a buzzword. And so I use the word decolonizing with as much respect as what I can, whilst being really uncertain. And I would be keen for the participants in the session to please share their thoughts with me on this, about how we use this word in such a way that it does not just become a buzzword. But I think Appleton's piece is excellent in that she talks here about using other words as we embark on the really long-term goal of decolonizing. So to diversify, to digress, to decenter, to devalue, to disinvest, and to diminish some voices and opinions while magnifying others. So I thought that that is perhaps an important point for us to reflect on. I would love to hear from the participants in this session whether they think we should perhaps not be using the word decolonial, decolonizing, decolonization. So maybe, I don't know if Maria or Lawrence can maybe just give me a heads up. How long would you ideally like me to talk, and when can I stop talking and start getting participants' feedback? I don't know if anyone can maybe let me know on that front.
I think you can go on talking, and people know that you're willing to stop talking at any time. So
okay.
If you have comments, people, please put it in the Q&A so we know to ask Mr. L to pause to discuss it. And I will just do that if something comes up. Okay, great. Yes, please do. Don't feel like you need to wait for me to end before you get involved. Yeah. So I will say that what I'm going to do now is just reflect a little bit on some of the debates, contentions, tensions that there are around what the concept of decolonization even means, just to show the contestations that there are. And then based on that, I'm going to try to show you some of the things that I am experimenting with in my own classroom here in South Africa. But again, I would be really keen for any of you to get involved in this. And I do have some questions at the end that I would specifically love to hear more from each of you about. In an ideal world, what would you like your economics curriculum to look like if we were to draw from decolonial scholarship? Yeah. Okay. So in terms of then the meanings of decolonization, I think part of the question that I ask myself, and I would love to hear more from the participants, is as we look through some of these definitions, shall we call them, of decolonization, is which of these conceptualizations resonates most strongly with each one of you and why? And then I think it would be fascinating for us to talk through where are the convergences and divergences between the different conceptualizations of decolonization. Because as I engage with this work, at least for me, there is a tension of
decolonization, not me wanting to be prescriptive about this, and many decolonial scholars not wanting to be prescriptive about what decolonization is, whilst at the same time balancing that with the fact that we don't, which economic pluralism and lots of the work that Rethinking Economics does is sometimes accused of, is that pluralism or decolonization is just accepting that anything goes, that it can be everything and nothing, right? And so I think that for me, at least, these tensions come up as I am engaging with just even the concept of what it means to decolonize. Which is, of course, surrounded by the discussions on what it means to diversify, to democratize, lots of discussions around pluralism. And as I say, I'd be eager to hear your perspectives on this. I'm going to kind of read out the comments as they come along. So I see that Mira is saying, I think we should use the terms. It will be one step towards recognizing the injustices meted by the system of the past. It will also help us to point out the systemic injustice, exclusionary practices in the capitalistic system. That's awesome, Mira. Yes, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we see some of the definitions that are coming through here, but there is lots of agreement with you on this point. So thanks for sharing. Right, so this is a more recent book that has come out. And here, Barbara Gabriel and Nissan Kalu are talking about decolonization, or decolonizing involves a multitude of definitions, interpretations, aims, and strategies. As we're reading through this, I think it would be really useful for all of us to think through why it is that economists might be really uncomfortable with this idea of decolonizing, right? Especially when we think about economists wanting to claim, universality of economics, the truth that we know around this is what good economics is, and anything that isn't good economics is just bad economics. Our obsession and over-reliance with quantitative measures, and if we can't measure this and put this into some panel data where we can run some sort of sophisticated regressions to be able to determine causality, then is this even economics? Yeah. So whenever I'm engaging with this literature, I always think to myself that it is unfortunate, but I can understand why many economists are, to be charitable, very uncomfortable with even a discussion about decolonization. Right, but then to broadly situate its political and methodological coordinates, decolonizing has two key references. First, it is a way of thinking about the world which takes colonialism, empire, and racism as its empirical and discursive objects of study. It resituates these phenomena as key shaping forces of the contemporary world in a context where their role has been systematically effaced from view. I mean, so echoing a lot of what Mira was contributing here. Secondly, it purports to offer alternative ways of thinking about the world and alternative forms of political praxis. And yet within these broad contours, decolonizing remains a contested term consisting of a heterogeneity of viewpoints, approaches, political projects, and normative concerns. This multiplicity of perspectives should not be surprising given the various historical and political sites of decolonization that span both the globe and 500 years of history. Right, so I feel very strongly about, in these instances, giving the exact words and reading the exact words of how scholars are trying to define this. But as I'm reading this, please feel free to contribute and to tell me where you might be in agreement or disagreement with this. I see, is it Neil? I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. As Fanon thought of it, decolonization is a process of national liberation, which is inherently violent. It feels a bit strange for economics to use it if we aren't putting that front and center. Yes, so I would be in agreement with you. I think because the aim of the session is for us to reflect on this in the curriculum, I would be keen to hear if there is any textbook that does this. And so I think that is part of a broader discussion that we're going to hopefully get to about knowledges, in that how can we put together resources, materials for our students to read and not just put it as like a little star of additional resources on the side of the reading list. But how do we make this idea of the process of national liberation being inherently violent? How do we put that front and center into our curriculums, especially when economic history and the history of economic thought is just non-existent in many instances, but also I think when we have, especially amongst mainstream economics, such recalcitrance towards other disciplines, which have done this much, much better than what economists have, right? We can also talk a little bit about de-disciplining in a second. Right. So here, this is Chalisa from a 2012 book as well. This is actually an economist, a methodologist, sorry, from Botswana. But decolonization is a process of centering the concerns and worldviews of the colonized other so that they understand themselves through their own assumptions and perspectives. It is an event and a process, which is something that, especially when I'm working with management within universities, they are not keen to understand this as a process, but just very often where we veer into the parts of this becoming a buzzword, just, okay, well, did you add some scholars from the Global South perhaps to your reading list? Tick. Now we can tick this box and say, we now have a decolonized curriculum, right? And so then Linda Tuiwe-Smith has an excellent book, Decolonizing Methodologies. Here again, emphasizing that decolonization is a process which engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. The importance here talking about reclaiming history. And again, I think this theme that is coming through of knowledges. So coming to know the past has been part of the critical pedagogy of decolonization. To hold alternative histories is to hold alternative knowledges. So I think emphasizing part of what has already been brought up here in the chat. Then I do think that this is an important point, which I would be keen for us to discuss further. But decolonization, however, does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all theory or research or Western knowledge. Rather, it is about centering our concerns and worldviews and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. And so I think that this allows us for an opportunity to be able to ask ourselves whether we, especially if we think about the work that Rethinking Economics has done to really advocate for pluralism. I try to, at least in my classrooms, not have an or mentality that we need to teach either this or this, but rather an and mentality. And much as there's definitely disputes about this within the decolonial literature, at least for me, my point of departure is for us to, when it comes to economics curriculums, to teach and, right? And not to say that simply because this is knowledge that comes from the West that we need to reject all of it, but for us to, if we think about what Appleton is talking about, for us to digress from the established canon of what mainstream economics does or teaches. And so then this is the last slide on this point, but Sabelo Ndlovu-Kgatsheni has a great piece in the Third World Quarterly in a 2020 article here. So bringing again to the fore this discussion of how do we not be prescriptive about what it means to decolonize, whilst at the same time not having this become it means everything and nothing, especially to people who are not seriously engaging with the scholarship. It is really interesting for me to see, shall we say, drawing the boundaries more closely about actually suggesting the 10 Ds of the decolonial turn. So you'll see here there is a discussion about decanonization, deimperialization, depatriotization, deracialization, de-disciplining, which I'd like for us to talk a little bit more about. But so you can take a look through these, and I really encourage you to read the paper. But so really to emphasize here that decolonization is a vast enterprise and it is multidimensional, which again, I think is something that economists can be quite uncomfortable with. At the center of decolonization is inextricably intertwined ethical, methodological, epistemological, and political dimensions. And this, at least for Sabelo Ndlovu-Kgatsheni, is where there is a perhaps divergence from the post-colonial to the decolonial, that it is very much so for the decolonial an ethical, methodological, epistemological, and political dimension, where within the post-colonial, and I'll show this to you in a second, the division, I don't know if it's, there was a session last night with Professor Charushila, which was amazing, and I would really encourage everyone, if you went to that session, to take a look at it. So I don't know how interested everyone is necessarily in these distinctions between post and decolonial. Again, there is debate here. I'm not sure, at least for me, whether there has been enough work done on the differences between the two. But at least for me, I think that both are really useful to draw from and to read the scholarship around this. So Bambara has a 2014 piece trying to differentiate between the post-colonial scholarship and decolonial scholarship. And you can see, I don't think I have the time to go through all of this, but some of the scholars that were influential there. And to emphasize my own positionality, of course, being a South African, when I read this, I will ask myself, well, where is African intellectual thought coming to the fore here? And so this piece of Ndlovu Kgatsheni that I'm talking about, this 2020 piece, is offering also a criticism even on Bambara's work, to say that this is really ignoring the contributions from African and Black scholars. And in this article, there is an entire table where Ndlovu Kgatsheni is pointing to the different African intellectual scholarship that exists. And to just again reflect on this, please do go take a look at that table and ask yourself whether you think any of those scholars or their work would ever be included in your curriculum. And if you start engaging with their work, to ask yourself whether you think it should be included in your curriculum. And especially whether you think it should be included in your curriculum, even if you are a student in the global north. I mean, sometimes, and well, actually very often these binaries of global north and south are not necessarily useful or relevant, and things are certainly more complex than that. Unfortunately, sometimes for levels of abstraction, using binaries do happen. But with that caveat in mind, I would really encourage all of you to think through whether you think it should be absolutely mandatory and a core part of an economics curriculum for us to reflect on the work of African scholarship, perhaps, yeah? And so then Klutsanova and Mignolo also have this, which I would just want to emphasize here, in trying to differentiate between the post and decolonial, but really that decolonial thinking shifts the politics of knowledge towards problems and questions that are hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. And that has also been a useful reflection for me. I see that we have something in the chat. So Lawrence is saying, using the word decolonizing was really a step for me to be able to think through race and historical injustices. Without it, I think I would be less able to think about it in an economic or educational context. I'm so glad to hear that. I remember when I got involved with rethinking economics and was really impassioned about economic pluralism, I think it's great to see how the discussion has shifted, that yes, economic pluralism is important, but that in and of itself can still be deeply Eurocentric. And yes, for me, decolonizing has allowed us to recognize that that is important, but to also push beyond that. And so then I see that Maria is saying, I've heard mainstream economists claim to not understand what decolonizing has to do with this discipline. It's not one like sociology or politics. Yes, Maria, this is a really important point that you're making. So even last night, Professor Tarashila was talking about when questions were asked in economics seminars, responses from more established and mainstream economists saying, like, well, you're making an interesting point, but I really think that belongs in the realm of sociology. What you're really asking is an anthropological question, or a philosophical question for that matter. And I think that is, and we can have lots of discussions about what does it even mean to de-discipline, but at the very least, I think that is part of questioning what it even means to be an economist, and what does the economics discipline exactly even mean. Can we say that it means something very, very specific? Are we comfortable with the contestations around, perhaps especially around what Rethinking Economics is doing, not just at this festival, but the Rethinking Economics chapters all over the world are doing to question this very mainstream conception of what economics even means. And I myself am questioning that. Should I identify as an economist even? If I'm told by those within the economics profession that, well, this is just not economics, I think this is something all of us need to ask. Do we push back and say, well, actually, this is definitely economics? Do we maybe ask ourselves, does it even matter whether this is economics or sociology or anthropology? Are these, which are in many instances have colonial influences in terms of being able to try to delineate and to partition disciplines? So is it useful for us to say, fine, it's not an economic question, then I'm asking a sociological question, but it's an important question and a necessary question? I would love to hear more thoughts on this one. Jebli is saying, I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on economic studies that centers not only on the extractiveness of the current economies that are ranked higher, but to centralize economies that cares both for human and environment, also including economies that have been marginalized into the informal economy. This is wonderful. I would be keen, Jebli, to hear your thoughts on that question too. Not just my thoughts on it, but perhaps relating to this, especially in terms of economies that cares both for human and environment. This paper that is on decoloniality and anti-oppressive practices for a more ethical ecology, I think is a really interesting read and speaks a lot to this. Also drawing from this, from languages. And if one is using language to be able to try and see how in many languages, African languages, I would draw from this too. But so, you know, in South Africa, we have 11 official languages, and talking about in some African languages, not to make Africa this homogenous entity, acknowledging the diversity that exists, but that there is not necessarily different words for what it means to be human and what it means for us to prioritize the environment, right? That this, that being human and caring for the environment and seeing the environment's well-being as inherently linked to your own well-being, is that there are not even different words for this. And yeah, in terms of economies that have been marginalized into informal economies, I think that this is a place where binaries are really problematic, and where, at least in South Africa, there is a massive push towards seeing informal economies as they are wrong, inferior, backwards, and what we need to do at all possible costs is to formalize them. And so, you know, part of what I'm suggesting when it comes to our curriculum is, when we are grappling with informal economies, whose knowledges are we prioritizing? Why are we not inviting informal traders into our classrooms? Why are we not taking our students outside of our classrooms for us to engage with informal traders? Recognizing that even the word informal can be really problematic, and for their knowledges to be shared and expressed with students, for them to be seen as experts, rather than for us to be pushing this, well, we need for, when we are engaging with the topic even of informal economies, for us to push for the formalization of those economies, whilst acknowledging that there can be real problems within informal economies. And so again, I think that's where it's useful for us to break down the binaries between formal and informal. Yeah. Right. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time getting more specific about the curriculum. But before I do that, the focus of the session is on the curriculum, but I think it would be disingenuous to claim that this is an easy project, but also to acknowledge that a curriculum is embedded within departments, within faculties, within universities, and that is very context specific, not just depending on the country or even the province, but, you know, the specific university, the specific department within the university that you may be. So I don't profess here to have answers. I'm really just reflecting on my own experience teaching at a university here in South Africa, but also to recognize that universities are embedded within economies and within societies. There is dispute amongst the decolonial and post-colonial scholarship. If we think about Tuck and Yang's work, that decolonization is not a metaphor, they explicitly state in their work that decolonization doesn't have a synonym. And for them, decolonization is very strongly about ensuring that the injustices of people who have been dispossessed of their land are corrected. Whereas other scholarship is pointing to universities having been sites of colonial and imperial power relations, and the importance for us to explicitly think through what it might mean to even decolonize a university. Whilst again, I think the importance of acknowledging that this is embedded within a broader economy and economies and within our societies, recognizing the structural nature of this project, and then perhaps on days when I'm just astounded by how massive the challenges are, to ask ourselves, is it even possible to decolonize a curriculum, never mind an economics curriculum, when there is so much of the colonial and the neo-colonial, the imperial, that still continues to shape our lived realities? And where do we start? What is the best place for us to give of our time and energy to this project? I don't definitively have answers for this, which is why everyone that's joined the session or anyone that watches the recording, I would be really keen to hear your thoughts on this. Okay, so I think part of this then is unlearning accepted power relations. So I don't know if we're dealing with like undergraduate students or postgraduate students, academics. I'm not quite sure who exactly is in the audience or who will watch this recording. But I think at least for first year students, your professors, the academics, they are seen as the fount of all knowledge. And I would really encourage everyone attending the session or watching the recording that they really shouldn't be seen that way. Students, at least for me, should be seen as equal partners in their economics curriculum, and that student experiences and students' expertise should be seen as important as whichever chapter it is that we are deciding we're going to be teaching in the textbook, right? Having had a very Eurocentric mainstream economics undergraduate and even postgraduates here in South Africa, although I think that a lot of that is changing. I remember being a first year economics student, and the very first chapter of our textbook was talking about Smith, Marx, and Keynes, and their contributions and their influence and their importance. And then we moved straight on to supply and demand graphs. And I remember looking around me and thinking to myself, if this is what we teach, I mean, most students in South Africa are not going to have the opportunity to be able to access postgraduate studies, right? If this is where we leave, who are the major contributors for economics, what does that say for people of color sitting in this classroom? What does that say for the women sitting in this classroom? What does that say for people who have not been born in the global north, right? And that discomfort led me to think that maybe there isn't a place for me within economics, right? So I think part of that then is us recognizing that as students, we can break down this idea about what it means to be an expert, right? So I've already made this point in relation to the informal economy, for example, but why are informal traders themselves not invited to share their knowledges in our classrooms? And when we're talking about knowledges, reflecting again on what Ndlovu Khatsheni is talking about, I would really encourage all of you, and I think this is something that I would hope you would get out of the session, to leave this asking yourself, where do you really want to start? But I think that there's a lot to be said about first respectfully trying to engage your lecturers. We can talk about when we might need to become naughty. I don't know if that's the correct word for this. And when we need to push back much more forcefully in terms of the power relations that exist within a university. But I think as a first step, as students, asking your lecturers for what it is that you actually want. So part of the question that I ask myself is, how do we unlearn that actually what students need is not one of the most powerful guiding forces in changing our economies? And so I think Rethinking Economics has done amazing things in terms of students being given the opportunity to recognize the power that they have, instead of just blindly accepting that this is what is in your curriculum. But lecturers can really be your partner in this. I think, speaking as a lecturer myself, at least initially being understanding of the fact that, especially if you're dealing with a more experienced economist, they are going to have devoted decades of their lives to a very mainstream, very Eurocentric, or very Americanized combination of both of those economics. And to now tell them, well, I would like something more, something different, something that radically challenges a lot of what it is that they will have to unlearn, is going to be at the very least, a deeply uncomfortable process for them. So to perhaps try to be understanding about that, whilst pushing, and I think a lot of what the decolonial scholarship calls us to do is not just to deconstruct, but also to reconstruct. And I think that the application of that to our curriculums is not just to say, part of what we're going to discuss a little bit more in the slides to come, but to not just say, well, this is what's wrong with what you're teaching, this is what I don't like about what is being taught, but about saying, but I also have suggestions and recommendations for you. So yes, and then I think important to identify who might be allies. So you're probably not going to get this right in every single economics module that you have, but who are lecturers that are more open-minded towards this? Do they exist within your university? Do they exist outside of your university? Do they particularly exist within the global south, perhaps? And then to take on the structural relations of power in universities. Are you making headway with your lecturer? If not, Rethinking has a lot of great resources about doing things like curriculum reviews, setting up meetings with managements of your universities. Are we going to move outside of the classroom? Are we going to use social media? Are we going to use political activism? Are we going to write something in the newspaper of your university because you're trying to make headway, but you're not managing to do that within your curriculum? So really emphasizing the importance of organizing. So in terms then just of co-creating, to be able to deconstruct and then reconstruct, I think we need to be explicit as academics about explaining to our students why we're actually doing this. But I would encourage you, if your lecturers haven't done this, for you to ask them at the beginning of the semester, could you show us the whole curriculum? And then for you to tell your lecturers if you think that there is anything that's irrelevant there and why that might be the case, right? So the curriculum at large. But then part of what I attempt to do with my students is to have at least 1 week where the students, and the bar is so low for this, but right, making a start, to devote at least 1 week to a student chosen topic, right? And you can go about this in different ways, but to ask your lecturer, could there be 1 week where the students are going to actually teach the class? Your lecturer can get involved in teaching this as well, but then I literally create a poll on our e-learning platform. I ask students to make suggestions and recommendations. I sometimes teach really, really large classes. So then I will whittle that down to a couple of common themes and then ask students to vote on which topic it is that they would actually want in their curriculum. And yes, of course, we can organize reading groups and we can try and do this where, we attend Rethinking Economics festivals outside of the formal curriculum. But I think that this is hopefully an opportunity to be able to get your lecturers to realize that you are there to help them co-create the curriculum, and that what you are interested in, what you want to know more about, should be reflected in the official university curriculum. I'm just going to pause here for a second before I talk about methods of assessment, because I see that there are some questions.
It's about to butt in. So I think you've kind of answered the first one, but there is a specific element to it. So Mira is asking, how do you think we can bring in more scholarship to discuss and evolve solutions to deal with the time poverty faced by these marginalized segments? And I know that you've just been talking about ways to change the curriculum. Lawrence, have you asked Mira if maybe she wants to unmute to comment on this?
I can do that now.
Okay. Mira, it's perfectly fine if you don't want to, but it would be nice to get you in.
Hi.
Yeah, lovely presentation. Thank you for that. And I was just wondering on this aspect, like we talk about decolonization, we talk about how to mend the correct situation, how to help these people, how to bring in the human element to everything we do. But we should, something that we always miss out on is this time aspect of it, because most of these segments or sections that we are trying to help. So I'm from India. So the biggest thing is, where is the time for all this? Even if there is like a program, there is this issue of time poverty for them to actually have access to it. So how do you think scholarship can start discussing how to introduce it into the curriculum and how to go forward?
Okay, great. So Mira, just to get clarity, do you want to discuss a bit more about like how do we find time in the existing curriculum to bring in a week where students are able to choose their own topic, or are you specifically interested in the fact that students don't have enough time to be able to engage with all of the additional stuff that we want to bring in?
Yeah, so yes, on the second aspect as well. I mean, I think I'll just be like butting into Afreen's question also then, because
Yes, go for it.
because like it would be like it would just classroom oriented, wouldn't help shape them or help them better the conditions. I mean, it wouldn't help economics contribute because they're just stuck to their classroom. Like students won't be able to go out and implement or work towards bettering things. On the second aspect, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the two are actually related to one another, at least for me. So if we are dealing with that there isn't time in the curriculum, and how do students now, this is talked about a lot with economic pluralism, and now we're saying, well, we also need to decolonize, right? So just like, where is the time? I think that is about asking, taking a step back and asking, in terms of knowledge production, what actually needs to be taken out of the curriculum, yeah? In order for us to say, okay, well, I have limitations. I have 4 hours a week to be able to teach this class, and students have so many different modules. How are they going to be able to engage with all of this? And now we're asking them, especially pedagogies of discomfort speaks a lot about this. We're asking them to grapple with some really uncomfortable stuff and question their own privileges. I think that has to go hand in hand with asking ourselves, when we're teaching the solo growth model, do we need to teach it for 5 solid weeks? Do we need to derive every equation? Is it particularly useful for a student in, I would say, anywhere in the world to have to spend so much time on things that are completely abstract and deeply irrelevant? Have we decided that things that mainstream economics thinks is massively important needs to stay there for as many weeks as what it does? So I think it is a battle on 2 fronts, right? A battle to ask what can we add, but also what can we remove, which requires this critical lens about what is actually relevant and useful and necessary and important for students, which will be very different answers depending on the country, the context, the province, the university, the department, the specific subject that you're teaching, yeah? And then also, just to be perhaps throw another spanner into the works, Jayati Ghosh was speaking at the Rethinking Economics for Africa last year, and she was making, I think, a really important point about these silos that we've created of the sub-disciplines within economics, right? So we have macro and micro and econometrics, and these are core, and maybe if you're lucky, you can take history of economic thought and what is political economy, even, heaven forbid. We talk about things like values, what does objectivity or subjectivity even mean? We're going to have like 5 different econometrics classes, but like what are qualitative methods even, right? Never mind, we're talking about decolonizing methodologies, blowing people's minds. And she was making this point: why do we continue to have these silos of, well, this is what you'll learn in macro, and this is what you will learn in micro, and this is what you will learn in econometrics? Is this a massive undertaking to try to break down this? Yes, but I think part of it is thinking about what are important questions for us to ask. How can we reconcile capitalism with the current climate crisis? Maybe that's the module. And then we can take from macro and micro and econometrics and sociology and anthropology and philosophy and outside of academia and political activism and the work that people are doing that don't subscribe to the identity of being academics. How can we answer that question? And I think that really allows us to completely rethink how much time we have for what. Does this happen overnight? No. Is it a massive task? Yes. But I think that what we can be inspired by in the decolonial literature is that this is a process. But I think it's a way for us to start to begin thinking about it. I don't know. Is that useful?
It's like, yeah, you answered it pretty much like, I mean, the question is, thank you so much, because I think it's a process and we'll have to wait and watch how, it unfolds. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I do not definitively have the answers for it, so I would be keen to hear
Yeah,
your thoughts. Or I'm going to just look. Is it a free?
Yeah.
Is decolonial?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is
Can we?
decolonial? Oh, yes.
Sorry, Michelle. No, I was going to ask
No.
Lawrence if maybe we can ask a friend to maybe unmute if they want to.
Yes.
Since we started on the hard questions. And while I'm giving them time to do that, there is another very similar question that I'm going to start reading out because I think the two are. So this person is saying, when speaking about decolonizing, we usually refer to power relations that are usually exterior to academia, and the academia's structure tends to reproduce and serve them. Should we distinguish relations from intra-academia power relations and structures like think tanks, lobbying, universities, rank lists, academic hierarchies and metrics, prestige and enforcement from a central university towards the periphery? And how should we analyze these issues both analytically and dialectically? And this person is saying that they're making this question having in mind how the biggest, very mainstream economics university in their country is enforcing, which will get a faculty spot, but also in that university, but also the rest of the universities in the country. And I see that Afrin is ready to go. So Afrin, do you want to ask a question too? Because I think, Michelle, you can take a job at both of them at the same time if
Sure.
we do only have 15 minutes left, so this very, very important answer, you can give it to us in a quarter.
Okay.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, and your resources are fantastic, and love if you could share a copy of this so that we can go through them piecemeal. So my question, uh, coming from a university which has had a tradition of being very vocal, considered anti-state, anti-government, so much so that we are often labeled as anti-nationals because we are often against the government. I was wondering about using about decoloniality and its use in everyday anti-colonial struggles. And I mean, my concern right now is that methods like these are often shared in academic institutions which are created and function within a neoliberal framework. How accepted are these right now? What is the scope of their, like, them being internalized and regularized as a part of a mainstream process? Because at the end of the day, like recently, especially after the COVID, what I'm seeing is that there's this new trend of funding happening, especially over here in the subcontinent, which is crowdfunding. Because of lack of resources, students are relying now on crowdfunding to get to their masters and their PhDs, and essentially this paves way for further marketization of their proposed research or their area of interest, which in universities might take on as a new way of gradation to find merit. And these are completely at the opposing ends of what we are proposing and the institution we hope to inculcate this into. How do you like how what is your experience in navigating these corridors of juxtapositions?
Afreen, I mean, of course, we can reflect on my experiences. I just feel like I've done so much talking already. Can I be naughty and say, could you reflect on that? I think it would be great for people to hear from your experiences.
I mean, for me, I'm still looking at this method, right? Because, like, even when we discuss things like post-colonial, right? I come from Kashmir, so for me, there is nothing such as post-colonial. Like, there are still contestations over citizenship over here. So
Right.
when we are still hung over this notion of like whether we are using post-colonial rights, suddenly we have a new term which just seems like just another fad. I mean, I'm sorry to use this term, but that's what often happens. Or I wonder that if it is just another method wherein people are just creating niches for themselves, like just monetizing another trend. So as a researcher right now, I mean, I'm still very curious about this. I'm optimistic about this, but yeah, I'm still figuring out how useful would this be while we are functioning in the same institutions which threatened by this method. And we surely have already, without using these terms, being like we face a major pushback even without using terms like coloniality and everything, anti-coloniality. So yeah, that is my experience. So I'm just wondering, is this something just a new way of appropriating people's struggles, or will it extend to grassroots movements actually in places where people are trying to fight for self-determination and struggles like those?
Afreen, thanks. That is so much more useful than what I possibly could have said. So I really appreciate it. I will at least just reiterate for me that I think this is what is encouraging for me about the decolonial framework, is to acknowledge that what it means for me in academia is very different from what it's going to mean for other academics in other places and contexts, right? And that I cannot be prescriptive about this. But also, if we are going to talk about decolonization, then it is about guarding against very strongly that this doesn't just become, I want to say, intellectualization about this, right? It's really useful and interesting, I think, for us to look at the different contestations that there are around the concept even of decolonization. But I mean, I understand at last year's festival, we just asked students, what do they think it means to decolonize, right? But that is still within a university, within a colonial understanding, I think, to a large extent, of what education even means. And I think a broader decolonial project is to ask ourselves, how do we get outside of the ivory tower? To ask ourselves, so when is this useful for us to fight a larger battle against imperialism on the front of what happens at universities, versus if we were to ask activists, people living just, what does it even mean to say someone who is living outside of the university, right? But like the general public, the average person, whatever that may encapsulate, if we were to ask them, what does decolonization mean to you? Would they even care? Would they be interested in these debates? So I think that is important for us to ask ourselves about what is our role. So, I mean, currently my role is as an academic, and then about asking ourselves, is this useful for your role as a community organizer? Is it useful for your role as a political activist? Is this useful for your role as someone who is just trying to get by each day? We have 49.2% of South Africans living on 1,227 Rand. They don't care about the debates and the disputes around decolonization in this sense. But I do think that that is part of a broader project for people in their own lived realities to engage with this. That is invariably going to mean that it's going to become much more specific when I start talking about what does it mean to decolonize an economics curriculum at my university, right? I think that's inherent in the abstraction and the specificities that will go hand in hand with any concept. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I think we have very, very few minutes left. So I'm just going to quickly emphasize a couple of points. I would really encourage all of you to hopefully get your lecturers to at least think about the idea of not using a single textbook. And if we're talking about knowledges, so I refuse to use a textbook in any of the modules that I teach, but that has been an interestingly long battle, and I understand that there will be many structural power relations that may prevent this from being possible. But would we ever have your grandparents' wisdom, students sharing what it is that their elders have passed down from generation to generation as what is seen as economic knowledge? Would that ever be considered? This is the core content you need to prepare for this week. This is what is actually informing our economic interactions. Would something like memes, Twitter threads, would a blog post, would a video on YouTube, will this be considered knowledge? I think that we need to push back on this idea that only journal articles, and even then only journal articles in top 5 economics journals, or only mainstream textbooks or only book chapters are knowledge. They definitely are too. But I think that we can do more to encourage students to explicitly think through what are actually knowledges. I did skip this point about students getting involved in their method of assessment. I let my students choose at least one way in which they would want to be assessed, and I've often gotten the best work when my students tell me, no, I don't want to answer multiple choice quiz. What I'd like to do is go back to the high school in the informal settlement where I grew up, and I want to talk to students about the 4th Industrial Revolution and what that might mean for what you're going to study and your job opportunities into the future. That is what I would want to do. There is so much economics happening there. And I would really encourage all of you to push back on this idea that you get no say in how it is that you are assessed. So much more to be said on that. We could talk a little bit about economic pluralism, which is definitely a start, but can still be deeply Eurocentric, so we don't have enough time to talk through that one, but I would say something for us to just think about. And then the importance in terms of de-disciplining. So as an example, just a small one and definitely not nearly enough, but Jemima Peer has this great article, The Racial Vernaculars of Development, A View from West Africa. I explicitly give this piece to my students. I tell them this is from an anthropology journal. Do you think that there is something useful for you as an economist to learn from this, accepting that we're still dealing with some of the binaries of this is economics, not economics, anthropology, not anthropology? But so this is an assessment question that I gave to my students last year, for example. So examine how Jemima Peer's The Racial Vernaculars of Development can inform our understanding of the World Bank's systematic country diagnostic of South Africa. Based on this examination, justify if the World Bank has realistically analyzed an economic development challenge in South Africa. Part of trying to push this idea that it's not just economists that can have answers for how our economies function. Yeah. Small point quickly then just on the history of African economic thought. So this is from the YSI's website. And this is a severely under-researched area. Having fought a battle to be able to teach the history of economic thought recently at my university, I was asking myself, what will I teach on the history of African economic thought? And if you just take a look at some of these suggestions of these names, I would encourage each one of you to go and Google them. And just on there, if we're using it as a bad proxy, the Wikipedia page will not put the word economist next to any of the suggestions that there are here, right? Which I think, again, points to the importance of us breaking down this idea of what it even means to be an economist and from where can we learn from in order to be able to teach a more reflective economics. I've put a little bit here in terms of like networks. I'm part of DECON, which stands for Diversifying and Decolonising Economics. Dawn is doing some absolutely amazing work, the African Macroeconomic Collective. Sometimes Twitter can be a hopeful place. I really think we should, to Afrine's point, try as far as possible to embed ourselves in communities outside of simply academia, ask ourselves, how can we get outside the confines of what we actually deem as experts? Obviously, to think about who might that actually be in your context. I have found some of the most useful and insightful things from post-colonial poetry, actually. And so then just in closing, I hope that we can be excited about this process, even if it's sometimes breathtaking at how large the challenges may be, but an opportunity for change, for innovation, for discovery. There are certainly challenges, definitely, but I think therein also lies the opportunity to have more of the lived experiences of a more diverse group of people reflected back at us in a way that encourage us to build and to construct anew. And I think that's what's so exciting about having all of the people that have joined today, that there are communities that exist, and that we should be seeking them out. We don't have to do this alone. So yeah, here is some final questions that we can perhaps ask ourselves. Maybe this might be useful for all of you to ask yourself as you are entering into a new semester, whilst accepting that this is a very, very narrow view of decolonization, but to ask yourself, what might you want your economics curriculum to look like? So yes, there is some of the questions that might be useful for you guys to think about. I think we only have like 2 or 3 minutes left. I would be keen for anyone else to jump in. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think my Twitter handle has been shared, and I can type my email address in the chat box. I would love it if anyone who is part of the session would want to engage so that I can learn more. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So this was brilliant. I'm going to say that I didn't know Michelle. I just by accident listened to her give a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I want her to come to the festival. So I know that it's really daunting sometimes to reach out to people when, especially if you're a student. But please do email her or us if you want us to like be the go-between. We're more than happy to, and we're all really doing this to connect to people that we wouldn't otherwise. And it sucks that we're online, but also, you know, I'm in Greece at the moment. I would never get to meet anyone that's here today in normal circumstances. So this is great. So yeah, please do connect. It's really nice. And I also put it in the chat. We'll find a way to put the resource list online so that people can get to read some new stuff that's not Western centric. So Matt is thanking everyone. Says this has been a great session with lots of perspectives and ideas, and says that perhaps there's scope for alliances with people in other disciplines moving in the same direction. And yes, can I just say that I have kind of escaped economics for sociology. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. It got too hard, I'm not going to lie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Maria. Thank you so much to everyone that joined. It was really wonderful to, more than anything, to get your questions and your experiences and your reflections. It makes me so excited. So yes, please get in touch. Teach me things. I would be so keen to learn from all of you.
Okay, so I have to close the session because we have another one starting in 15 minutes. I was going to say the time, but then I thought we're all in different time zones. It doesn't make any sense. If you're free, please do join us. We're going to be talking about the present and future of informal economies. We're going to do a case study / discussion-based session. We have someone presenting from Latin America, talking about the situation on the ground and what policy changes could possibly help better conditions for informal workers. So thank you, Michelle, again. Thank you, Lawrence, for all the help. And thank you to everyone that put your ideas in the chat. And hope to see you again somewhere else. Bye.
Bye, everyone.